titled Black CEO Denied First Class Seat 10 minutes later. He orders the captain off the plane. He had the ticket, the name, the right, but still, they looked at him and saw someone who didn't belong. What happens when a calm, composed black CEO boards a flight he owns only to be humiliated, profiled, and removed from his seat before takeoff? Who gets to decide who belongs in first class, and what happens when the man they tried to erase is the one holding the highest power in the sky? This is not just a story about race, it's about dignity, silence, and the quiet systems that try to keep certain people small. But what if just once someone didn't shrink? What if they stood tall, without yelling, and changed everything you're about to witness a moment where truth boards quietly but lands like a thunderclap? Get ready for a story that will break your heart, stir your soul, and make you question everything you thought you knew about power, prejudice, and what it means to belong. If this message speaks to you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now, take a deep breath and let's begin. The cabin didn't hum, it whispered. Soft leather seats and muted cream lined the narrow aisle, the faint scent of cedar-infused polish still clinging to the air like memory. The jet was new. Too new. Everything shimmered with the quiet pride of private wealth, the kind that never had to announce itself. Julian Cross stepped onto Skylure Flight 305 without ceremony, no assistant, no luggage, except the folded scarf resting over his forearm. No introduction. He moved like a man used to space, but never owned by it. Tall, linen shirt tucked in just enough to stay sharp, but loose enough to suggest he hadn't come to impress anyone. He didn't make eye contact with the two flight attendants prepping beverages at the front. Not yet. Instead, he glanced down at the boarding slip in his hand. Seat 1B. A window seat in the flagship aircraft of Skylure Aviation, his company. But no one in this cabin knew that, and that was the point. Julian wasn't here as the CEO of Verity Group. He was here as a man walking into a space that didn't expect him. He found the seat without hesitation. 1B, front row, the kind of space designed for executives, dignitaries, or heirs with last names that belonged on buildings. He lowered himself slowly, adjusting his scarf across his lap. He looked out the window. The sky hadn't judged him yet, but he could feel it. The cabin was watching, from behind. Someone cleared their throat, not a casual cough, but a clearing, the kind meant to cut. Julian didn't turn. "Sir?" A voice called softly. A woman, polished, clipped tone. He turned to see a tall, stern-faced woman in a captain's uniform walking toward him. Blonde, mid-50s, shoulders squared like a wall. She didn't offer a greeting. She offered a pause. "I'm Captain Lana McConnell," she said. "I'm going to need you to confirm your credentials." Julian raised an eyebrow. "My credentials?" "Yes," she replied quickly. "This seat is reserved for pre-cleared individuals. I don't see your name on the manifest." Julian offered the slip of paper between two fingers. "Calm. Please verify." She didn't reach for it. From across the aisle, another passenger shifted loudly. A man in a tailored navy suit, silver cufflinks flashing as he stood. He didn't ask permission. He took the boarding slip from Julian's hand and tore it in half. "He's not listed," the man declared. "You're trying to sneak in, aren't you?" Julian still hadn't moved. The man tossed the torn slip onto the floor, then returned to his seat with a smug grunt. "This is first class," he said, for real clients, not drop-ins. Julian leaned forward slowly, picked up the torn boarding pass. He didn't respond, didn't glare, didn't raise his voice. He simply refolded the halves and placed them on his lap. The flight attendants looked over but said nothing. One of them, younger, eyes uncertain, glanced at Captain McConnell. She nodded toward her. "Please recheck the iPad," she said. The young attendant tapped quickly, then spoke. No record of passenger Julian Cross in seat 1B. A second of silence, thicker than before. Captain McConnell crossed her arms. "You're not listed, and you're delaying our takeoff. I'll have to ask you to move." Julian met her eyes for the first time. They were cold, not cruel, just used to control. His voice was warm. "Even. I'm asking you to double-check. That's all." The older man in seat 1A chuckled. "You people always think you're above protocol." Julian tilted his head slightly, but still didn't answer. At the back of the cabin, a woman in her 30s closed her book. Samara Quinn, Nigerian-American, designer, quiet but perceptive. Beside her, a younger man pulled out his phone. Journalist, maybe. He lifted the device slightly, thumb over the record button. A woman 3 rows back reached forward, touched his wrist. "Not yet," she whispered. "Let him speak." Julian turned toward the young attendant again. "What's your name?" he asked. She blinked. Mira Ellis." "Mira," Julian said gently, "I'm not here to cause delay. I'm only asking for due process. Verify with corporate, if you must," Captain McConnell interjected. "We don't take orders from unauthorized passengers." "You haven't confirmed that I am unauthorized," Julian replied calmly. Mira glanced at her iPad again. She frowned. "Maybe there's a sync error." Garrett Sloan, the man who tore Julian's pass, stood again. "Sync error. He's not on the list. End of story. You don't just wander onto private aircraft." Then he reached into his coat and pulled out a shiny black card. Elite status. "Skylure doesn't let just anyone sit here. You need this." Julian glanced at the card, then back at him. "I don't need a card," he said softly. "I need truth." The line lingered, suspended in air like vapor. Mira's fingers trembled slightly. Julian picked up his phone, pressed a button. A voice came through, female, crisp. "Talia Monroe speaking." Julian's voice didn't rise. "Talia, begin logging this interaction." "Yes, sir, already recording. Do you wish to proceed?" Julian looked up, right into the captain's stare. "Let's give them one more chance to choose integrity." The temperature in the cabin changed, slight, subtle. A few passengers shifted. One adjusted a tie. Another closed her laptop. Julian exhaled, but said nothing more. For now, it wasn't the silence of surrender. It was the silence before something shifted, because behind that scarf, behind the simple shirt and quiet presence, sat the man who didn't just own a seat. He owned the skies, and they were about to find out. Julian didn't move. The torn boarding pass still rested gently in his lap, edges uneven, folded once across the center like it might someday be pieced back together. The cabin remained still, but the stillness was no longer neutral. It had taken sides, not with words but with glances. One glance from seat 3C lingered too long, curiosity shaded by suspicion. Another from 2D flicked away the moment Julian looked up. The way some people retreat from the idea of discomfort before they've even named it. And just behind him, someone whispered. Not loud enough to catch the words, but loud enough to feel them. Julian had been here before, not on this aircraft, not with these people, but in rooms like this, where air turns into tension and silence sharpens like a knife, where a black man's calm is mistaken for arrogance, where presence alone becomes a provocation. He breathed in slowly, let the cabin press around him, and held his peace across the aisle. Garrett Sloan adjusted his cufflinks with a smug grin that hadn't moved since he tore the pass. "You know what I don't get," he said, looking past Julian but aiming his words directly. "How people like you keep ending up in places like this." Julian tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but clarity. He wasn't surprised, just tired. Before he could reply, someone else finally spoke. "My name is Ava Morales. I'm a civil rights attorney." The voice came from 3 rows back, measured, crisp. "I've been watching, and I'm not the only one." Garrett turned his head but didn't respond. Julian looked toward her. "Thank you," he said, softly. Ava nodded, then said nothing more. She knew when to speak and when to observe, and right now, it wasn't her story to lead. Mira Ellis, still holding the iPad in both hands, took a tentative step forward. "There's no entry under your name," she said, "but the system has had sync issues before. Maybe it didn't update properly when we loaded this morning." Captain Lana McConnell frowned. "Mira," she said, tone tightening, "you checked the manifest. He's not on it. That's the end of it." "But what if it's wrong?" Mira asked, not quite looking her in the eye. "It isn't." The finality in Lana's voice wasn't about facts. It was about control. Julian looked at Mira, not with accusation, with gentleness. "Do you have a way to verify with corporate?" he asked. Mira hesitated, then nodded. "I do," she said. "Then I'd appreciate if you used it." Lana cut in sharply. "No, that's unnecessary. If he has a problem, he can wait for the next flight." Julian's voice dropped half a register, not loud, but unmistakably firm. "This isn't about a flight, Captain. It's about truth." Across the cabin, a man in his late 20s scribbled notes into a black notebook, his pen moving quickly but carefully. His name was Noah Rivers, a junior reporter for an independent policy outlet in D.C. He wasn't here for a story, not at first, but the story had found him anyway. He looked up now, eyes narrowed. The scene unfolding in front of him wasn't just uncomfortable. It was familiar and dangerous. He'd written about this before gatekeeping in elite spaces. Protocol used as armor for prejudice and the subtle ways power excused itself from accountability. But this wasn't subtle anymore. Garrett leaned back in his seat again, legs stretched out as if he owned the row. "Listen," he said. "No offense, but we have a schedule. This whole performance is becoming a distraction." Julian turned toward him, voice composed. "Is that what this is to you? A performance?" "You said it," Garrett smirked. "I'm just calling it what it looks like." Julian held his gaze for a moment longer, then returned to his phone. Talia was still listening. He could hear her breathing, steady and precise. "Status?" he asked. "We've begun tracing your original check-in credentials. You were manually removed from the Skylure manifest 2 hours before boarding. No internal note, no authorization code." Julian paused. His jaw tightened slightly. "Who has clearance to make that change?" "Only Flight Command and select senior staff on this aircraft." "Thank you. Keep logging." Mira turned slowly to Lana. "Captain, is it possible someone changed the system without telling me?" Lana raised her chin. That's not your concern." Noah's pen stopped moving. He stood. "I have a question," he said, directing it toward Garrett. "That card you flashed earlier, your Skylure Elite Pass, may I see it?" Garrett blinked. "Excuse me, just for a moment. I cover aviation policy. I'm curious." Garrett scoffed but held up the card. Noah leaned in, squinted, then frowned. "That's not the current design. Skylure changed their elite badges last spring." "What are you saying?" Garrett replied, defensively. "I'm saying," Noah answered carefully, "that your status might be as fake as your authority." He turned to Mira. "Can you scan it?" She looked startled but nodded. She reached for her device, activated the scanner, and aimed it at the badge. Beep, then nothing. No match. The screen read, "Unrecognized ID." The cabin stirred. Garrett turned red. "That's a mistake." Julian didn't even look at him this time. Instead, he turned to Lana. "So, a verified guest with no badge just invalidated your so-called priority passenger." A pause. Then he added, "And you still think I'm the one who doesn't belong?" Lana's nostrils flared. She didn't answer. Julian looked back to Mira. "Still want to check with corporate." She nodded quickly and stepped into the galley. Samara Quinn, who had remained silent until now, spoke for the first time. "People like me don't usually sit in first class either," she said quietly. "But today, I paid full fare. I passed every check, and I still watched you look at me like I borrowed the seat." Lana turned toward her. "No one's questioned your status." Samara met her gaze calmly. "You didn't have to. You looked at me and decided how much dignity I deserved." The words cut deeper than anything shouted, and Lana didn't reply. Julian glanced toward the window again, his reflection faint in the glass, not angry, not defeated, just weary. He remembered the first time he was told to move to the back. 3rd grade, a field trip. The teacher hadn't meant harm, she said, but he was still told that front row isn't always best for everyone. He had spent decades unlearning that sentence, and here it was again. Different uniform, same story. A notification pinged through his phone. "Talia, confirmation received," she said. "You were flagged without cause. We have the logs. Time stamped. Initialed." "Thank you," Julian replied. "Keep the line open." He looked up at the cabin, the watching faces. "You may not know me," he said slowly, "but I know this flight, and I know it better than any of you." The silence that followed wasn't just still. It was rattled. Mira Ellis stood just inside the galley, staring at the handheld device in her hand as if it had just betrayed her. The confirmation from corporate had arrived, and it said everything she didn't want it to say. Julian Cross had been manually removed from the flight manifest by someone with internal access. It wasn't an error. It wasn't a glitch. It was deliberate. And yet out in the cabin, Captain Lana McConnell continued to hold her ground like a statue carved from entitlement. Mira took one breath, then another. She didn't step out just yet. She had joined Skylure Aviation to see the world, to grow, to serve, not to be a pawn in whatever quiet war this was becoming. Back in the cabin, Julian hadn't shifted his posture. He still sat calmly in seat 1B, scarf neatly across his lap, back straight, shoulders relaxed, but his eyes had changed. The softness in them had cooled into steel. Not anger, but something heavier. A kind of mourning you carry when you're forced to relive what you thought you had outgrown. Captain McConnell faced him now, arms crossed, feet shoulder-width apart. "You've caused quite a stir. Mr. Cross, she said, her voice as smooth as her badge. Julian met her eyes. I haven't caused anything. I sat in the seat assigned to me. Garrett Sloan, still red-faced from having his fake status exposed, muttered something under his breath. Julian turned slightly, louder. Garrett, you seemed proud a moment ago. Garrett said nothing. Lana stepped closer. We're going to resolve this, she said. You had every opportunity to do that 20 minutes ago, Julian replied. Instead, you chose spectacle. Don't mistake protocol for disrespect, she snapped. I don't, Julian said calmly. I mistake your decisions for disrespect. At that moment, Mira stepped out from the galley. She looked directly at Lana. I got through to corporate. Lana's face didn't move, and he was removed manually. 2 hours ago, logged from a terminal on this aircraft. A beat passed. Lana's mouth twitched ever so slightly. That doesn't mean he was confirmed to begin with. Mira swallowed. Actually, it does. His check-in was cleared. His ID matched. He had an assigned seat, 1B. Julian spoke softly. Would you like to see the copy of the original record? Captain, my assistant, has it ready. Lana exhaled sharply. This has gone far enough. Noah Rivers stepped forward, his notebook still in hand. No, I think it's just getting started. She turned toward him. You're a journalist. What are you doing, recording, observing, asking questions? You know those things people do when something's not right. This is private transport. You have no authority here. And yet, neither do you. At least not the kind that grants immunity from accountability. Garrett finally spoke again. All right, enough of this parade. This man. He jabbed a finger toward Julian, showed up unlisted, delayed our departure, hijacked the attention of the entire cabin. That's grounds for removal. Julian stood. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. He rose slowly, gracefully, like a man who'd learned long ago how to stand in a world that wanted him seated. I haven't hijacked anything, he said. I've sat. I've waited. I've asked for clarity. He paused. You tore my boarding pass. You accused me of sneaking in. You mocked me in front of a silent cabin. And yet, I'm the disruption. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was necessary. Ava Morales stood now. Let's be honest, she said, looking around the cabin. If Mr. Cross had been white, in a suit and tie, no one here would have said a word. We're not reacting to protocol. We're reacting to presence. Garrett laughed dismissively. Oh, give me a break? No, Ava said sharply. Give him a break. Captain McConnell's voice hardened. I am the authority on this aircraft, and as of now, I'm requesting Mr. Cross be escorted off the plane. Julian tilted his head. On what grounds you're causing a disruption? To whom he asked. She didn't answer. Julian reached for his phone again. Talia. Her voice came through instantly. Yes, sir. Prepare to initiate identification protocol, level 1. Captain McConnell blinked. Identification protocol. Julian's tone didn't change. I gave this aircraft, this company, every chance to self-correct. You refused. He looked at her. So now we proceed differently. At the back of the cabin, Samara Quinn stood slowly, her fingers trembling around the strap of her carry-on. I don't feel disrupted, she said, her voice low but unwavering. I feel afraid. Not of him. Of you, Cliff Jennings. The security officer stationed at the front began to step forward. He hesitated. Mr. "Cross," he said, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside." Julian looked at him. For doing what? Precisely, Cliff didn't answer. He reached for Julian's shoulder. It wasn't forceful. Not yet, but it was permissionless, and that was enough. Julian's voice didn't rise. "Remove your hand." Cliff froze. Ava stepped forward. He's not resistant. He's not violent. He's not even raising his voice. "Why are you touching him?" Captain McConnell barked from behind. "Because he doesn't belong here." It slipped out too fast, too sharp, too true. Everyone heard it, and suddenly it wasn't about systems anymore. It was about bias with a name and a voice. Noah stopped writing. Mira gasped. Samara sat down slowly, eyes wide. Julian closed his eyes for a moment, not to retreat, to steady. When he opened them again, he looked around the cabin. You all heard that. No one spoke. Cliff stepped back. Lana opened her mouth, closed it. Julian turned toward the cockpit. "This aircraft belongs to Skylure Aviation. Skylure Aviation is owned by Verity Group. Verity Group is led by one person, me." He didn't yell it. He didn't need to. Captain McConnell blinked once, then twice. Julian reached into his coat and pulled out his wallet. From it, he removed a thin black access card. He held it up. Corporate level access. Verity Executive Tier. The same one used to board aircrafts in executive anonymity. The same one Lana had been trained to recognize. "You've just attempted to remove the CEO of the company you work for," Julian said. Garrett choked on his own breath. Noah whispered, "Oh my God." Ava smiled. "Just a little." Julian looked at Lana. "This is no longer a misunderstanding. It's misconduct." The cabin had changed. The air felt heavier now, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the tension. Julian Cross remained seated, his posture still steady, but inside, a storm of thoughts brewed quietly. His calm exterior was a shield not in indifference, but a reservoir of inner strength built over years of navigating worlds that weren't made for him. Captain Lana McConnell stood near the cockpit door, arms folded tightly, eyes sharp and unyielding. Her authority felt like a dam holding back a flood, but the cracks were beginning to show. Julian's gaze drifted toward Mira Ellis, the young flight attendant. Her hands were trembling slightly as she held the manifest device, her face pale. She was caught in a bind torn between loyalty to her captain and a growing awareness of the injustice unfolding before her eyes. Lana's voice cut through the stillness like steel. "This is not a negotiation. Mr. Cross, you have disrupted this flight enough." Julian lifted his eyes slowly, meeting hers with a quiet resolve. "This isn't disruption. It's recognition." Behind Lana, Garrett Sloan smirked. His confidence was like an old habit he refused to shake. Though the facade was cracking, his previously smug demeanor now appeared desperate, as if the truth threatening to surface was suffocating him. Mira's eyes darted toward Garrett, then back to Lana. She swallowed hard and, almost inaudibly, said, "Captain, I wasn't supposed to question, but there's something I need to say." All eyes shifted toward her. Julian sat up straighter, his presence commanding even in stillness. I received instructions last week," Mira continued, voice faltering, "to remove certain names from the digital manifest. I was told it was routine, that it was for security." The cabin seemed to pause, breath held collectively. "Did you know those names?" Julian asked gently. She nodded, tears starting to form. Yes. And one of them was yours. Julian's expression softened. This was no longer a test of authority, it was a reckoning with reality. Ava Morales stepped forward. That's obstruction of justice, tampering with official records. Lana's face darkened. Mira, you're mistaken. There was no such order. Mira shook her head, eyes wide. I was told to keep quiet, to do what was necessary. Garrett muttered under his breath, convenient lies. Noah Rivers raised his voice, convenient lies that end now. He held up his notebook. I've been tracking internal communications. Messages between crew members expressing discomfort with recent equity initiatives, a plan to undermine the CEO's reforms by smearing his reputation. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder. Samara Quinn, seated nearby, clenched her fists. This is more than just a seat or a name. It's about who we're allowed to be, who we're expected to be invisible for. Julian inhaled deeply, steadying himself. I've carried those expectations all my life, he said softly, told to smile and stay quiet, to be grateful for scraps of acceptance. But a smile doesn't belong where respect is denied. The weight of his words settled over the cabin. Mira wiped her eyes. I was scared. Scared to lose my job. Scared to be the one who broke the silence. Julian reached out, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. The silence broke itself the moment you spoke. Lana stepped forward, voice rising. You think this is about fear. This is about order, protocol. Without it, this aircraft can't function. Julian met her gaze without flinching. Order without justice is chaos in disguise. Cliff Jennings, the security officer, shifted uneasily. Sir, I need you to comply with the captain's instructions. Julian shook his head. I comply with truth. The cabin had become a battlefield, but the weapons were words and conviction. No fists thrown, no doors slammed, just the slow dismantling of a system that had allowed bias to masquerade as procedure. Noah lowered his notebook, voice calm but firm. Skylure Aviation is about to face scrutiny. It can't evade. Garrett, visibly agitated, grabbed his glass. You people always make everything about race. Ava cut him off sharply, because sometimes it is, because sometimes ignoring it lets injustice fester. Samara nodded. You made this about discomfort, Mr. Sloan, but discomfort is a small price to pay for dignity. Julian's gaze swept the cabin. This isn't a story about me. It's a story about every person who's ever been made to feel unwelcome where they belong. Mira took a shaky breath. I have something else. She stepped into the galley briefly, returning with a small leather-bound notebook, the kind used for personal notes, but in this case, a ledger of prejudice. No one was supposed to see this, she whispered. Ava took the book, flipping through pages filled with coded comments, remarks about skin tones, accents, clothing, and behavior, a shadow journal of bias, hidden behind the facade of professionalism. May 12th. Passenger in 4C looks suspicious. June 3rd, unverified, woman in 2D. Watch for attitude. July 18th. Preferred guests only limit exposure. The cabin fell silent once more. Julian's voice broke it gently. This is the truth they hoped would stay hidden, but truth has a way of finding the light. Lana's face paled, the mask slipping. Garrett looked around nervously, the smirk gone. Mira's hands trembled as she closed the book. Samara stood, voice steady. We deserve better, all of us. Julian nodded. And today, we begin building it. The flight attendants exchanged uncertain glances. Julian caught Mira's eye, offering a small, encouraging smile, a smile that said, "You're not alone." Julian watched as Mira hesitated near the galley door, her fingers nervously clutching the small tablet. She'd become an unlikely messenger in this unfolding truth, torn between her duties and the reality now impossible to ignore. "I have something else," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. The cabin fell into a hushed expectancy, as if every passenger sensed the gravity behind those simple words. Mira stepped forward and handed the tablet to Ava Morales. The lawyer's eyes flicked across the screen, scanning folders labeled with dates, flight numbers, and cryptic titles like routine logs and bias reports. This is a collection of internal complaints," Ava murmured. "Complaints that were never submitted to compliance." Julian leaned forward, curiosity sharpening. "How many dozens?" Mira said, swallowing hard. "Maybe more, from previous flights, from crew members, from passengers." Noah Rivers stood beside Ava, reading over her shoulder. These could be a smoking gun, a systemic cover-up. Julian nodded slowly. This isn't just one flight. It's an entire culture. Ava tapped a file, opening an entry from a flight 6 months ago. Passenger reported racial profiling in the lounge. She read, "Complaint filed with crew but deleted from the official system." Mira's eyes filled with tears. "I was asked to delete several of these complaints, told it was to protect the company's image. Instead, you archived them," Julian said softly, waiting for someone to listen. Mira nodded. "I never thought it would be me." Julian turned to the passengers. "This isn't just about me being denied a seat. It's about all the silenced voices." Samara Quinn's voice trembled as she added, "It's about dignity stolen piece by piece." The cabin remained quiet, the weight of this revelation settling like a heavy fog. Julian looked directly at Captain Lana McConnell. "Do you understand what you've allowed here?" Lana's jaw tightened, her eyes darting to the floor. For the first time, the confident mask faltered. "No," she said quietly. "I didn't realize," Ava interjected. "That's not ignorance anymore. It's negligence." Julian's phone buzzed again. He answered softly. "Talia, we've sent the archive to corporate legal. They're preparing for a full investigation." "Good," Julian replied. "And the manifest logs confirmed. The tampering was authorized from a terminal assigned to flight operations." Julian turned back to the cabin, his voice calm but resolute. "This is the paper trail, the record of every time a person like me was erased." Noah stepped forward. "I've been covering stories like this for years, but nothing hits as hard as witnessing it firsthand." Mira wiped her tears. "I kept hoping it was just a bad few cases, but it's everywhere. Every name you saw on that tablet is a person who trusted us," Julian said, "and was betrayed." Samara looked around the cabin. "What happens now?" Julian met her gaze. "Now we ensure it never happens again." He turned to Mira. "You showed courage today. You didn't have to." Mira gave a shaky smile. "I couldn't stay silent anymore." Julian nodded. "That's how change begins." The cabin seemed to exhale collectively. The weight of silence lifted just a little. Cliff Jennings cleared his throat. "Sir, I need to know your next steps." Julian fixed him with a steady look. "We start with accountability." He pulled out his phone. "Talia, initiate executive override. I want immediate suspension for those involved. Understood, sir?" He addressed the cabin again. I will be making a public statement. We will overhaul training, transparency, and reporting systems. Garrett Sloan, who had been quiet for some time, stood abruptly. You're making a spectacle of this. You think you're better than us? Julian's gaze didn't waver. No, I'm just demanding fairness, something you clearly can't offer. Garrett scoffed, but no one else joined him. Ava raised her voice. This is about more than one man's seat. It's about respect, integrity, and justice. The young journalist, Noah, closed his notebook, and it's about time someone stood up. Julian's eyes softened as he looked at the faces around him, some shocked, some inspired, some quietly hopeful. This flight is grounded, Julian said. Not because of me, but because it's time to rebuild what was broken. He pressed a button on his phone, and the cabin filled with the soft voice of Talia Monroe. Corporate legal is notified. Investigation underway. You have full executive authority, Mr. Cross. Julian stood, his figure silhouetted against the plane's windows, light filtering through like a promise. This is the paper trail, he repeated softly, and it's only the beginning. The galley was small, almost claustrophobic, yet it held a universe of secrets that Mira Ellis carried with her. She sat on the edge of a fold-out seat, the tablet resting heavily in her lap. Her breath was shallow, her hands trembling as she scrolled through the messages she had long buried, messages that now felt like shards of glass beneath her skin. She had wanted nothing more than to serve coffee and smiles, to be a part of something bigger without the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on her shoulders. But today was different. Today, the truth had exploded like a sudden storm, and Mira found herself caught in the center of it. Outside the galley door, Julian's voice drifted through, steady and calm despite the chaos around him. He was addressing the cabin, commanding respect not by volume, but by the quiet power of his conviction. Mira closed her eyes briefly and let the sound settle her. The messages she was scrolling through told a story far darker than any passenger could imagine. Crew members complaining about passengers being treated unfairly because of skin color. Whispered warnings to watch out for certain groups. Instructions to ignore or discredit complaints that threaten the status quo. One message stood out. Keep the logs clean. Delete any complaints flagged for race or ethnicity bias. Corporate doesn't want headlines. Mira's fingers hovered over the screen. For years, she had complied, scared of losing her job, of being cast out. But now, the fear had shifted. She looked up just as Ava Morales entered the galley quietly, her presence grounding. Those messages Ava asked softly. Mira nodded, voice barely above a whisper. I saved them all. I couldn't delete them. Ava took the tablet and scanned the screen. You've done the right thing. Mira shook her head. I'm scared. If this gets out, I don't know what will happen to me. Ava's eyes were steady. Truth has a price, but silence costs more. Back in the cabin, Julian was responding to questions, assuring passengers that this was not just an incident. It was a turning point. Mira's mind drifted back to the first time she'd seen discrimination in the skies. A quiet, almost invisible moment. A passenger ignored because of the shade of their skin, the whispered jokes between crew members, the denial of complaints filed quietly in the shadows. Her eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. Ava placed a hand on Mira's shoulder. You're not alone in this. Mira drew a shaky breath. It's bigger than me. Bigger than any of us. Ava nodded. That's why we have to be brave. The galley door opened softly and Cliff Jennings stepped in, his expression unreadable. "Ms. Ellis," he said, voice low, "I need to talk to you about protocol." Mira looked at him, wary but resolute. "I'm listening." Cliff hesitated. "I know things haven't been handled well, but removing Mr. Cross without following proper procedure, that puts us all at risk." Mira leaned forward. Risk or responsibility? Cliff's eyes flicked away. "We're following orders." "Whose orders?" Mira challenged. The silence stretched. Outside, the cabin's tension was palpable. Passengers whispered among themselves, some looking toward the galley door, sensing the unfolding drama. Mira's phone buzzed quietly. She glanced at the screen, another message. This one from a fellow flight attendant. "Be careful. They're watching." She sighed. "We're all watching now." Ava stood, ready to leave, but paused. "Mira, thank you for your courage." Mira nodded, a small smile breaking through. "It's time to stop being quiet." As Ava walked back into the cabin, Mira allowed herself a moment to look around the galley, at the tools of her trade cups, trays, coffee pots, mundane objects now touched by the weight of history. She thought about the passengers, about Julian Cross sitting just beyond the curtain, fighting for dignity in a space that had long denied it. The thought strengthened her resolve. Outside, the murmur of voices was growing louder, voices demanding change, voices refusing to be silenced. Mira closed the tablet and stood, determination in her step. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a witness and a part of the change. The small leather-bound notebook was like a ghost from a darker time. When Mira Ellis pulled it from the depths of the cockpit storage compartment, the air in the cabin seemed to tighten, as if everyone suddenly realized the weight of what was about to be revealed. Ava Morales took the book carefully, the soft crackle of leather opening like a shutter on a long-forgotten secret. The passengers leaned in, their eyes fixed on the pages filled with cramped, hurried handwriting, dates, and cryptic annotations. "This is a private flight log," Samara Quinn asked, voice barely above a whisper. "For the captain." "Yes," Ava confirmed, but not the kind of log anyone would expect. She flipped to the first tabbed section pages marked with dates and a series of code words. The handwriting was sharp and judgmental. May 25th, unverified woman in 3A, likely designer type. Watch for fabricated credentials. The room went quiet. No one blinked. May 34th, man in linen shirt, possible plant. If challenged, escalate gently. Don't engage on race. The words hung in the air, heavier than the polished leather of the seats around them. Mira swallowed hard, feeling the cold weight of truth settle on her shoulders. "This is a pattern," Ava said, voice steady but full of outrage. "Not just individual incidents, but a manifesto of quiet discrimination." Julian Cross stood, his gaze sweeping the cabin. The calm authority he had carried all along was now mixed with a righteous fire. So, it wasn't about documents, it wasn't about security or protocol, it was about who made them uncomfortable. Lana McConnell's face twisted, pale and defensive. "This notebook isn't policy, it's personal. It doesn't reflect Skylure Aviation's values." "Values?" Julian repeated slowly, a word meaningless without actions to back it. Ava turned a page and read aloud another entry. February 14th, the passenger granted 2 outspoken track-seating movements. Watch for activism. The murmurs grew louder. No one here should be afraid to sit where they paid to sit, Samara said, voice clear and unwavering, nor to speak up. Ava added, "This book proves that fear was manufactured." Mira stepped closer to the group, feeling the weight of each word. "I remember seeing that book before. The coded notes, the lists of preferred guests, mostly white, some names underlined, including Garrett Sloan." Garrett shifted uncomfortably, avoiding everyone's eyes. "June projection, remove outliers, shift equity appearances to PR only." Ava read the final entry. "That's not ignorance," Julian said, voice low but steady. "That's engineering discrimination." The cabin held its breath. Julian faced the crew, Captain McConnell, First Officer Richard Ellis, Mira Ellis, and Security Officer Cliff Jennings. The realization dawned like a cold winter morning. You built a system that picked favorites, hid behind euphemisms, and punished those who dared to belong. Lana opened her mouth, then closed it. Mira's eyes filled with tears, but she spoke with newfound strength. "We're done hiding behind secrecy." Julian nodded. "No more." He turned back to the passengers. This aircraft and this company were built on a promise, not just of luxury, but dignity. He paused, letting the words sink in. That promise was broken. A hush spread over the cabin, but today we begin to rebuild it. Noah Rivers lowered his notebook, his face thoughtful. "This isn't just a story anymore," he said softly. "It's a movement." Ava smiled. "Justice doesn't happen quietly. It happens with voices raised and truths told." Julian looked at Mira. "You found courage in the silence." She nodded. The cabin began to shift, not just in space, but in spirit. Samara wiped a tear. "Thank you for seeing us." Julian smiled gently. "We see you. We all belong here." Julian Cross remained standing, one hand resting on the seat back in front of him, the other holding the notebook that had, moments ago, turned this flight into something much bigger than travel. His fingers gently brushed its edges, as if touching the very pages could help him absorb the years of pain written into them. Yet he did not tremble. He simply breathed. The cabin was still again, but not silent, not really. It pulsed with unspoken energy, a collective reckoning rising like the cabin's own heartbeat. 100 questions hung in the air, but none louder than the one behind Julian's eyes. "How long have I carried this weight alone?" His calm was not the kind that came from comfort. It came from discipline, from knowing, deeply and intimately, that his very presence in certain spaces would always be challenged, always be asked to explain itself. He closed the notebook gently and looked toward the galley. Mira stood beside the coffee cart, watching him. "I never knew who you were when you boarded," she said quietly. "I didn't want you to," Julian replied. Why Julian let the question sit for a moment. He turned, facing the aisle, speaking now not just to Mira, but to everyone, because I needed to know how you'd treat someone without power, someone who didn't wear a title on their sleeve or a badge on their chest. He paused, his voice softened. "I needed to know how my company treats dignity." Noah Rivers stepped closer, eyes fixed on Julian. "That's why you didn't use your name at check-in. You came here as a test." Julian nodded of the staff, of the system. Samara Quinn leaned forward. "And what did you find?" Julian looked down for a moment, then back up. "That we're still failing." A low murmur ran through the cabin. Captain Lana McConnell hadn't spoken in several minutes. She stood near the cockpit now, arms still folded, but her stance had weakened. She no longer looked defiant. She looked cornered, and yet pride still flickered behind her eyes. "This wasn't intentional," she said finally. "You think I'm a villain? I was following procedure." Julian turned toward her slowly. "I don't think you're a villain," he said. "I think you're tired of being challenged by change." Lana bristled. "You don't know what it's like trying to maintain control in this environment." Julian tilted his head. "No, but I know what it's like walking into every room, knowing I have to be perfect to be accepted. I know what it's like to be seen as a disruption before I say a word." He stepped forward, closing the space between them. "I know what it's like to smile while being doubted. To offer kindness to those who don't think you belong." Lana said nothing. "Captain," Julian continued, "you didn't just question a passenger. You questioned the right of someone like me to sit in silence without explanation." From the back of the cabin, Ava Morales called out gently, "What do you want us to do?" "Julian, what happens next?" Julian looked around at the faces watching him, faces now full of waiting, of wondering, of hope and shame and uncertainty, all pressed into one breath. He tapped his phone. Talia's voice came through, calm and ready. "Yes, Julian." "Are we ready?" "Corporate protocol initiated. Full executive authority granted." "Thank you," Julian said. Then he turned to Lana. "This will be the last flight you captain under Skylure Aviation." Gasps rippled through the cabin, not from shock at the consequence, but from the clarity of its delivery. "You've violated protocol, you've violated trust, and you've weaponized procedure to protect bias." Lana's face remained unreadable. Julian turned to Richard Ellis, the first officer, who had stayed silent throughout the entire ordeal. "Richard," Julian said. "Did you alter the manifest?" Richard swallowed. "Yes, sir. Why I was told to. I didn't ask questions." Julian nodded once. "That's not an excuse. That's compliance without conscience." Richard dropped his head. "I understand. Effective immediately. You are suspended from all operations. An investigation will determine if reinstatement is possible." He turned to Cliff Jennings. "You enforced unlawful directives. You put your hands on a passenger who had broken no rule." Cliff shifted uncomfortably. "You are dismissed from this crew," Julian said. "You'll have a chance to respond in formal hearings, but for now, you are removed from duty." Cliff nodded silently and stepped back. Then Julian looked at Mira. She looked down, ashamed. Mira, her eyes lifted, unsure. "You made mistakes," he said, "but you chose truth when it mattered most." Mira blinked, holding back tears. "I can't tell you whether you'll keep your position. That's not my call alone. But I will say this: you showed courage in the dark, and that matters." She nodded slowly, voice cracking. "Thank you." Julian turned to face the cabin one final time. "I didn't come here to punish. I came here to understand. But understanding leads to action, and action leads to change." He looked at Samara. "You shouldn't have to thank me for being seen." She smiled through tears. "But I still do." He turned to Noah. "You've recorded this. I assume you'll write it." Noah nodded. "But not just to publish, to remember." Julian looked down the aisle once more. Then he spoke with a voice that had no tremble, no hesitation. "I am Julian Cross, CEO of Verity Group, owner of Skylure Aviation." He paused, breathing in slowly, and I promise you this: no one will ever be erased in my company again." The announcement had landed like thunder. Passengers were no longer shifting uncomfortably in their seats. They were still, reverent almost, like witnesses to something sacred and unsettling. A reckoning wrapped in professionalism and poise. Julian Cross remained standing near the front of the cabin, composed as ever, yet carrying the visible weight of every word he'd just spoken. Behind him, the notebook, the ledger of systemic bias, rested on the armrest of seat 1A, untouched, since Ava Morales had closed it in silent grief. Captain Lana McConnell didn't move. Her hands were limp at her sides, and her lips trembled just slightly. It wasn't the embarrassment of being caught. It was the slow unraveling of a worldview that had gone unchallenged for far too long. "You can't fire me on the spot," she finally said, her voice barely audible. Julian turned to face her, eyes calm but unwavering. "I'm not firing you, Captain. I'm ending your authority in this space. The rest will be handled by policy." "You're making a mistake," she said, more to herself than to him. "No," Julian replied. "I'm correcting one." She opened her mouth again, but the words didn't come. Instead, Richard Ellis, the first officer, stepped out from the cockpit, expression drawn and pale. I'm sorry," he said, looking directly at Julian. "I should have said something when I saw your name on the removal list. I knew it wasn't right." Julian regarded him for a long, quiet moment. "Why didn't you speak up?" Richard shifted on his feet. "I was scared. I thought maybe it was just another corporate reshuffle. I convinced myself not to question it." "Silence protects comfort," Julian said, "but it never protects the people who need it most, behind them." Cliff Jennings was still seated, arms crossed over his chest, trying not to meet anyone's gaze. He had not spoken since being dismissed, but his posture had changed. Gone was the rigid pride. What remained was fatigue, mental and moral. Julian looked over to Garrett Sloane, who had gone strangely quiet. He stared blankly ahead, his once smug demeanor crumbling under the growing realization that he no longer held the upper hand. Mira Ellis stood just behind Julian, her eyes wide with conflict. There was a part of her that felt relief for finally stepping out of the silence. But another part, a deeper and more painful one, grieved for the innocence she knew she'd never get back. "Mr. Cross," she said gently. He turned toward her, his expression softening. "I didn't mean to let this happen. I know. Do you believe I can be better than this?" Julian studied her for a moment, as though her question wasn't about permission, but worth. "I believe we all can," he said, "but only if we choose it." She looked away, swallowing tears. "I want to choose better," she whispered. Ava stepped up beside Julian. That's where justice begins. Not just in exposing the wrong, but in how we respond once the wrong is revealed. The cabin remained quiet, but its silence was no longer filled with tension. It was filled with reflection. Samara Quinn, still seated halfway down the aisle, finally spoke again. "I never thought I'd see this happen. A black man holding power this calmly, this completely, in a room that tried to erase him." Julian looked at her, then around the cabin. "Calm is a skill you're forced to master when the world is built to unsettle you." Noah Rivers took a slow step forward, his notebook lowered now, his voice gentle. "What are you going to do with the notebook?" Julian looked down at the small leather book that had upended the entire flight. "I'll deliver it to the ethics board," he said. It'll become part of a much bigger investigation, but it's also a symbol now." He paused, eyes scanning the passengers, a symbol of how small decisions, coded words, unchecked judgments can erode an entire system. A man near the back of the cabin raised his hand slowly. "Sir," he said, "my name's Thomas. I'm just a businessman on his way to a conference. I've never seen anything like this, but I want to say thank you." Julian nodded in appreciation. "We've all been taught to keep our heads down." Thomas continued, "To mind our business, but today I saw what silence costs." Julian turned toward the front of the cabin again. "Talia," he said into his phone, "I'm here. Prepare to ground this aircraft at the next available terminal. Send a shuttle to retrieve the remaining passengers. We'll complete their journey safely. But this flight, this crew won't continue in its current form." "Understood." Cliff finally spoke. "Sir, will we have a chance to be heard?" Julian met his gaze directly. "You'll have a chance to be accountable." There was no malice in his tone, just a firm sense of consequence. The PA system crackled. The flight's digital assistant announced, "Estimated arrival at Anchorage Executive Terminal in 20 minutes. Passengers began whispering again, but the mood had changed. It wasn't panic or anger anymore, it was clarity. They had been part of something real, something raw, something they'd carry with them long after landing. Lana sat down slowly in the captain's chair near the cockpit, her hands trembling. For the first time, she looked not like a woman in charge, but like a woman realizing just how far she'd fallen from her purpose. Julian sat as well, slowly, next to the window where the Alaskan light was beginning to shift into late afternoon gold. He leaned back, resting his hands on the armrests, looking out into the clouds. He didn't feel victorious. He felt something else, something heavier. It was never about winning. It was about not disappearing. It was about staying, even when they tried to move you. Even when they tore your name from the list. Even when they called you a disruption just for existing in the front row. Talia's voice returned through the earpiece. "Would you like me to prepare the press briefing?" Julian smiled faintly. "No, I think I'll handle this one myself." The descent began in silence. The aircraft dipped beneath the clouds, revealing a sweeping view of snow-laced mountain ridges and scattered pine forests outside the wide oval windows. The sky had turned to a pale gold, the kind of soft light that made even the hardest edges seem gentler. But inside the cabin, the air held the weight of something irreversible. Julian Cross sat in seat 1B, the very seat he had been denied less than an hour ago. He had returned to it not out of victory, but because leaving it empty would have been its own kind of silence. This time, when he sat, no one objected. He watched the horizon with the quiet presence of a man who had stood on principle and refused to fold. But he wasn't basking in righteousness. He was reflecting on everything that had happened, on the pain it had brought, and the responsibility it demanded. Ava Morales stood a few feet away, her arms crossed not in defense, but in focus. "You okay?" she asked, her voice low. Julian turned slightly. "I don't know if that's the right question anymore." Ava sat down across from him. Then what is Julian thought for a moment. Maybe, are we finally ready to see the cost of pretending she didn't answer right away? Instead, she followed his gaze out the window. "There's something poetic about landing in Alaska after all this," she said softly. "The edge of everything, like we had to come all the way here to see the truth." Julian nodded. Sometimes the edges are where we remember who we are. The voice of the digital assistant chimed overhead, announcing approach into Anchorage Executive Terminal. A gentle reminder for passengers to return to their seats followed, but many had already done so, moved not by instruction, but by awareness. Garrett Sloan sat 3 rows behind Julian now, staring blankly at the screen in front of him, though it wasn't playing anything. His world had changed shape, and he hadn't caught up. Not yet. Mira Ellis stood in the galley again, this time upright, shoulders squared. She watched the passengers with something new in her eyes, not fear, but conscience. Noah Rivers sat with his notebook open, though his pen had long stopped moving. He wasn't writing, he was absorbing. He knew what he'd witnessed today would ripple far beyond a single article. Samara Quinn clutched a scarf in her lap, her hands still. It was the scarf she had designed herself, patterned with subtle symbols of resistance and resilience. She had worn it before without expecting it to matter, but now it felt like a flag. The aircraft touched down gently. No sudden jolt, just a smooth, decisive landing, the kind that didn't make an announcement of itself, but left no doubt it had arrived. Julian felt the wheels make contact with the earth, and something inside him exhaled. He closed his eyes for a second. It was done. Or at least, this part of it was. The aircraft rolled to a private hangar, a separate building that resembled more of a high-end conference center than an airport terminal. Discreet, exclusive, shielded from public view until now, outside, 3 black SUVs and a line of suited personnel were already waiting. Talia Monroe had moved quickly. Julian didn't need to ask how she'd coordinated it. That's why she was who she was. Cliff Jennings unbuckled his harness in the jump seat and waited. No longer an enforcer of order, but a man awaiting judgment. He didn't look at Julian. He didn't have to. Some lessons don't come with eye contact. They come with consequence. The seatbelt signs turned off. The passengers rose slowly, a few of them pausing to glance toward Julian before reaching for their belongings. Thomas, the businessman who had spoken up earlier, approached Julian's seat. He didn't smile. He simply extended his hand. "Thank you," he said quietly. Julian shook it. For what? For reminding us that leadership isn't about being in charge. It's about showing up when it matters. Julian nodded once. Safe travels. Thomas. One by one. Passengers began to deboard, some in silence, others whispering soft expressions of gratitude. Not all fully understood what had happened, but they knew they had been part of something that would outlive the flight. Mira stepped forward next. "I know this isn't over," she said. "No," Julian agreed. "It's just beginning. I want to help, in whatever way I can." Julian looked at her, saw the change in her face, the shift from hesitation to purpose. "You already have," he said, "but there will be more work to do." She nodded. "Don't let this harden you," Julian added gently. "Let it deepen you. I will." She turned, stepped off the plane, and walked into the gold-lit terminal, where 2 representatives were waiting for her. One smiled reassuringly. The other carried a file. Noah approached next. "I've got everything," he said, "but I won't publish until I get your blessing." Julian gave a faint smile. "The world deserves to know, and I trust your voice." Noah hesitated. "Do you ever get used to being the story?" Julian looked down the aisle, then back at him. "No, and I hope I never do." With that, Noah stepped off, ready to write something bigger than a headline. Last came Samara. She stood beside Julian's seat, eyes shining. "Don't disappear after this," she said. "I don't plan to." "Good. We need more people like you visible." Julian gave a slow nod. "And we need more people like you willing to speak up." They exchanged a look that said everything. Shared history, even if unspoken. She stepped off the aircraft, her scarf brushing lightly against her side, like a banner in the wind. Julian stood, alone now, the cabin empty. He turned once to look at the row of seats behind him, the scene of confrontation, of erasure, of resistance. He picked up the small notebook from 1A's armrest. Then he stepped into the aisle and walked toward the exit. Outside, the air was crisp and the sun was low, casting long shadows against the tarmac. A new kind of silence settled over the jet, one not of tension, but of transition. Talia Monroe stood by the second SUV, clipboard in hand, her face unreadable as always. Julian approached her. "How bad is it?" he asked quietly. "Internal comms are already preparing a statement. Legal is reviewing the manifest tampering. And your inbox is about to explode." He nodded. "Let it." Talia studied him. "You okay?" "No," he said, "but I'm clear." She gestured to the vehicle. "Let's get you to the debrief." He paused, looking back at the aircraft one last time. "I want it taken out of rotation, grounded for internal review. No flights, no PR tours, just reflection." Talia nodded. Julian climbed into the vehicle and sat back, the door closing with a soft thud. For the first time that day, he let out a long breath. The plane was on the ground, but the truth had just taken flight. The conference room was glass on 3 sides, with a view of the Alaskan landscape that felt more metaphor than setting. Mountains stood in the distance like silent witnesses. Snow dusted the pine trees below. The light was pale, but it filled the room with an almost spiritual stillness. Julian Cross sat at the head of a long, dark walnut table, shoulders relaxed but face firm. It had been 2 hours since the wheels touched down. An hour since the internal investigation team had arrived. 37 minutes since the first headline appeared online. CEO removed from seat in discrimination scandal. Then takes control mid-flight. It was already trending. Across from him sat 3 members of the Verity Group board, connected virtually from their offices in New York, London, and San Francisco. Alongside them were legal counsel, internal ethics officers, and Talia Monroe, standing to his right, tablet in hand. "I want transparency," Julian said calmly. "Full transparency." The woman from San Francisco leaned in on the screen. "Are you certain?" "Julian, if we release all of this, the logs, the ledger, the transcript will face blowback, lawsuits, union pressure, public scrutiny." "I'm counting on it," he said. "You're inviting the fire, I'm walking into it," Julian replied, "because people have burned quietly for too long." There was silence for a moment. Even through the digital haze of video conferencing, the weight of his words lingered. The man from London adjusted his glasses. "What exactly do you want us to authorize?" Julian reached forward and slid the leather-bound notebook across the table. "This," he said, "along with Mira Ellis's digital archive, the recorded passenger testimony, the suppressed complaints, everything." Talia spoke up. "The press already has pieces of it. We're playing catch-up, not damage control." "And the crew?" the woman asked. "McConnell, Jennings, Ellis." Julian nodded slowly. "They'll be part of a formal ethics review. Not a public spectacle, but a thorough process. transparent, measured, fair. The board shifted. Some leaned back, some frowned. Finally, the man from New York spoke. "You know, you're not just protecting the company's image right now, you're defining its legacy." Julian looked straight into the lens. Exactly. When the call ended, the room exhaled. Talia remained standing, her eyes scanning her tablet, but her voice was gentle. "You've just launched the largest internal review in Skylure aviation history." Julian leaned back in his chair, and she smirked. "It's the right move?" He nodded. It was never about being right. It was about being true. She sat next to him now, softer than usual. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What was going through your head when she told you to move before anyone knew who you were?" Julian paused, his hands folded on the table. "I heard my father's voice," he said quietly. Talia tilted her head. "He used to tell me, 'Son, you'll have to earn twice the respect to get half the peace.' I thought I was past that. I thought this seat, this company meant I'd cross the finish line." He looked out the window, eyes misting just slightly. "But that moment reminded me the line always moves for people like us." Talia didn't respond immediately. She let the silence do what it was supposed to give the truth space. "Finally," she said, "you didn't flinch." Julian smiled faintly. "I wanted to, but flinching doesn't change anything." He stood and walked toward the glass, his reflection faint in the window. Outside, 2 news vans had arrived. Their presence didn't bother him. It confirmed what he already knew. This wasn't just about what had happened on one flight. It was about every boardroom where silence bought time, every gate where names vanished from the manifest, every job interview where Polish wasn't enough, every table where someone waited to be invited, only to realize the table was never meant for them. He thought of Mira, of her fear, her trembling hands, but also of her spine straightening when the truth emerged. He thought of Samara's scarf, of Noah's pen going still, of Ava's steel resolve. He thought of Garrett Sloan, who still hadn't spoken publicly, though rumors swirled that he was already consulting legal counsel. Julian walked back to the table. "We'll name it," he said suddenly. Talia blinked. "Name what? The initiative," he clarified. "The system we build from this, the equity overhaul, the policy rewrite, the accountability protocols." She looked intrigued. "You have a name in mind?" He nodded. "The echo chamber." She frowned. "Why that?" "Because for too long, people have been forced to shout into silence, their truths bouncing off walls, ignored, dismissed." He took a breath. "We're going to build a chamber where every voice is heard, especially the ones that have been echoes for too long." Talia smiled now. "It's bold. It's overdue." There was a knock at the door. A young woman from legal entered. "Mr. Cross, Mira Ellis is here. She asked to speak with you privately. Send her in." Mira stepped into the room, dressed now in plain clothes. She looked younger than she had earlier, but somehow stronger too. Julian gestured for her to sit. "I heard about the initiative," she said softly. "The echo chamber." "You already heard the name, no," she said, "but I felt it before I walked in." Julian nodded. "I want to be part of it," she said. He smiled. "You already are." She looked down. "I know I failed. I hesitated when I should have spoken. I enforced silence when I should have questioned. But I want to learn. I want to lead. Eventually." Julian studied her face. She didn't sound like someone chasing redemption for appearance's sake. She sounded like someone who'd been humbled and awakened. "I believe you," he said. "Really, I saw the moment your heart broke open, and I saw what grew in its place." She blinked hard, fighting emotion. "Will people believe me? Maybe not all," Julian said gently, "but the right ones will, and you'll believe in yourself. That matters more." Mira stood. "Thank you." As she turned to go, he said one last thing. "Mira." She looked back. "You didn't just serve drinks today. You served a reckoning." Her breath caught, and she nodded once before leaving. Julian sat back down, alone again. The sky was darkening, but inside him, a new day had already begun. A week had passed since Flight 227 landed in Anchorage, but in every office hallway, every corner of social media, every boardroom facing a mirror, it didn't want to look into Flight 227 hadn't landed at all. It was still flying, still circling in the minds of people who now had to ask themselves what they'd been willing to ignore. Julian Cross sat quietly on the balcony of his home outside Seattle, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long golden streaks over the garden below. His phone was face down on the table. It had not stopped vibrating for days, but for this moment, he let the silence return. He didn't need reminders of headlines. He didn't need corporate briefings. He needed stillness. He needed to remember the feeling of that first-class seat under him. Not the comfort of leather or the luxury of space, but the quiet, profound truth that he had stayed in it, even when they tried to erase him, even when procedure told him to move, even when the silence of the cabin begged him to surrender his presence. He had stayed. He had filled the seat, and because of that, something had broken open in the world. Talia Monroe appeared in the doorway behind him, tablet in one hand, a faint smile playing at her lips. She was always composed, but today she let something softer show through. "You ready?" she asked. Julian turned, nodding slightly. "I think so." She handed him the tablet. "You've got 10 minutes before we go live." Julian scrolled through the headlines at the top of the screen. Verity Group launches the Echo Chamber Initiative. Mira Ellis to join Executive Equity Training Council. Ava Morales appointed Independent Oversight Chair. Flight 227 the seat that stayed filled. He lingered on the last headline. "Did you come up with that one?" he asked. Glancing up, Talia shook her head. "Noah Rivers did. He published it last night." Julian's smile deepened. "He gets it." As the screen dimmed, Talia added, "We have letters, thousands, some from employees, some from passengers, some from strangers." Julian raised an eyebrow. "Anything surprising?" She hesitated, then pulled one from her bag. "This one's from a little girl in Atlanta." She handed it to him. The letter was written in crayon, with words scrawled large and uneven across the page. "Dear Mr. Cross, my mom said you are brave. I want to be like you. I'm 7. I like planes. I want to sit in the front, too, one day. Thank you for not getting up." Julian closed his eyes for a moment, then folded the paper carefully. Talia gave him space. She always knew when to let silence speak. 10 minutes later, Julian stepped into the Verity broadcast studio. The room was minimalist, no gold, no staging, no distractions, just a camera, a microphone, and a world ready to listen. He sat down, exhaled once, and waited for the countdown. 3, 2, 1. He looked into the lens and began. "This is not a press statement. This is not an apology. And this is not a brand reset. He paused. This is a reckoning. His voice was steady, not raised. He didn't need volume. He had truth. A week ago, I boarded a flight with my name missing from the manifest. I was asked to step aside, not because I'd done anything wrong, but because someone didn't believe I belonged. He breathed again, letting the silence hold the shape of his pain. For far too long, dignity has been conditional, reserved for those whose presence makes others comfortable, for those who look like they've earned it. He leaned forward, his tone softening. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand special treatment. I simply stayed in the seat I was meant to sit in. Another pause. But this story is not just mine. It's Mira's, who found her voice. It's Ava's, who made justice tangible. It's Samara's, who wore her pride without asking permission. It's every passenger who's ever been asked to move, not just physically, but spiritually. Julian's eyes didn't flinch from the camera. We are launching the Echo Chamber Initiative to dismantle the systems that quietly categorize people by comfort, not character. We're rewriting policies. We're re-educating leadership. We're rebuilding trust. A slow breath, because this isn't about optics, it's about humanity. He held up the crayon letter. This came from a little girl named Kayla. She wants to sit in the front one day. A long pause. We owe her a world where she doesn't have to ask. He set the letter down. I didn't want this attention. I wanted accountability. And now that we have it, we will not waste it. His final words were not rehearsed. They came from a place deeper than preparation. I stayed in the seat. But the truth is, every one of us has a seat we're meant to occupy. In the workplace, in society, in our own dignity. He leaned in one last time. So don't give it up. Don't let the world talk you out of your place. A soft smile. Stay seated. The world needs to see you there. The feed ended. The studio fell quiet. Outside, the sun had climbed higher. Somewhere, a girl in Atlanta was probably coloring. Mira Ellis was likely reviewing onboarding documents for the new training council. Ava Morales was already preparing a proposal for federal-level accountability mandates, and Julian Cross was just a man on his balcony, sipping coffee, letting the breeze carry the memory of everything that had been broken and everything that had begun to heal. The seat had stayed filled, and now, so would the silence. No longer empty, but full, with voice, with presence, with power. He never raised his voice. He never threw a punch or demanded revenge. He simply stayed in the seat that was his. And because of that, the silence broke. Julian Cross taught us something many refuse to admit, that dignity, when quietly protected, can roar louder than outrage. His calm resistance on Flight 227 exposed the cracks in a system too comfortable with its own blindness. A captain was removed, a policy rewritten, a movement born. But more than that, millions of invisible passengers around the world finally saw themselves and felt seen. This isn't just about race, it's about worth. It's about the right to occupy space. Without apology. It's about refusing to move, even when the world politely demands your absence. To those who have ever been told to step aside, to quiet down, to fade out, this story is for you. You are not a disruption. You are the reason the world must change. So, if this story moved you, if it made you feel something stir deep inside, don't let that go. Share it with someone who needs to remember their worth. Like this video to support more stories that matter. Subscribe to this channel for the next powerful episode in our series on justice, courage, and truth. Because sometimes staying seated is the most radical act of all. We'll see you in the next story.